Thanks, Diana. I should maybe start by saying I recognise that for one group of people, being here just now may be particularly stressful. So for the football supporters amongst you, thanks for coming. And feel free to use whatever self-management techniques you find helpful to deal with the stress. I think it probably requires a certain level of foolhardiness to agree to write a book about Marxism and mental health, because, as I say in the introduction to the book, someone is going to disagree with almost something I say, I'm quite sure of that, so I'm sure that will lead to a good discussion. One area which has already provoked some debate is over the issue of terminology. Throughout the meeting, I'll be talking about, for reasons that I hope will become pretty clear, I'll be using the term mental distress. I did, in the initial version of the book, use the term occasionally mental ill health. One comrade felt that was too much of a concession to the medical model. Other comrades, reviewing this month's ISJ, feels we actually should use the term mental illness much more commonly. So clearly these are some of the debates around it. Other comrades have disagreed with what I say about Freud and so on. I think really what it says is that there's no single Marxist position on these issues, and that we conduct a debate reflecting that people have very different experiences and different views, and that's absolutely fine. Another comment, it's quite a short book. One comrade said to me, it's a good book, but why didn't you write a longer book? Not enough words. But although it's quite a short book, it actually, as those of you who looked at it will see, it covers quite a lot of ground. And you may be relieved to hear, I'm not going to try and cover all that ground today. So I'm not going to say very much about Freud and psychoanalysis. I'm not going to say an awful lot about R.D. Laing. But clearly, if comrades want to bring up these issues in the discussion, that's absolutely fine. What I do want to do, though, is to start where the book begins. And I want to focus mainly on the current crisis of mental health. I'm not going to use too many quotes, but I'm going to start with a quote that opens the book, which comes from the radical American sociologist C. Wright Mills in the late 50s. In talking about unemployment in the US, Mills draws a distinction between what he calls personal or private troubles and public issues. And what he says is this, is when in a city of 100,000, only one man is unemployed, that is his personal trouble. And for its relief, we look properly to the character of the man, his skills, and his immediate opportunities. But when in a nation of 50 million employees, 15 million men are unemployed, that's an issue. And we may not hope to find its solution within the range of opportunities open to any one individual. The very structure of opportunities has collapsed. Both the correct statement of the problem and the range of possible solutions require us to consider the economic and political institutions of the society, and not merely the personal situation and character of a scatter of individuals. And I start with that because what I argue in the book and what I'm going to argue today is that mental distress, the crisis of mental health, is one of the key public issues of the 21st century. It's actually very difficult to pick up a newspaper almost any day without some new feature about another aspect of that crisis. So in the past week, for example, there's been articles about the crisis in children's services. There's also been the announcement of a report which is due a little bit later this year on children's mental health, which is expected to show a massive increase since the last study was conducted a few years ago. In Scotland, the report came out 2 weeks ago, which shows that 1 in 9 young people have seriously considered suicide, and 1 in 6 young people have self-harmed. And then again this week, a report saying that there's been an increase in demand for student counselling services in higher education. I could go on and on and on, but basically, clearly, something very big is happening. And if we look more widely at the statistics, across the UK, so I just let me get these figures. Currently, 1 in 4 people experience a mental health problem in a year. Mental health is now responsible for the biggest, quotes, burden of disease, 28%, as opposed to cancer. Across the world as a whole, the World Health Organization states that depression now affects 350 million people, and in 2 years' time will be the leading cause of disability in the world. And interestingly also in The Guardian just a few weeks ago, they carried an article about Copenhagen, which apparently is the happiest city in the world, except, as the article says, 23% of people who live there say they feel stressed almost all of the time, okay? So maybe not that happy. So that's the first aspect of the crisis I want to look at. But the second that I want to look at is also in terms of how capitalist society responds to that level of mental distress, which is overwhelmingly to throw drugs at it. So, for example, again, a study came out in June 2017, reported that prescriptions for 64.7 million items of antidepressants were dispensed in England in 2016. That's a 100% increase on 10 years previously, at an all-time high. And if you live in some particular parts of England, particularly the northwest, 1 in 6 people living in the northwest of England is currently on antidepressants. Okay, so these are astonishing numbers. And just the last figure I'll throw at you in terms of children's mental health, there are now 58,000 under 18-year-olds in England on antidepressants, which again is more than double the number for 10 years ago. Now, of course, we can talk about greater access to services or whatever, but I want to argue that something deeper is going on. Third aspect of the crisis, which I'll come back and talk about in my talk, is the huge cuts to mental health services that have also taken place during that period. So really the purpose of the book and the point of the talk today is to really say what's going on, what's happening, and how can we as Marxists make sense of what is effectively an epidemic in mental distress, and of a response which is overwhelmingly based on drugs. So to begin to answer that question, I want to start by looking at what remains far and away the dominant way of understanding conditions like depression and anxiety, and even more so conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which is essentially to see them as illnesses, in all respects identical to conditions like arthritis, influenza, whatever, what's usually referred to as the medical or the biomedical model of the brain. Extremely influential in the US, but also influential in most other places. And very, very briefly and crudely, in this view, these conditions are seen to have their origins either in the brain in some form of usually in some form of chemical and or structural imbalance, or in the genes. And once diagnosed, should be treated in the same way as other conditions, which usually means some form of medication. Doesn't mean that social factors may not be seen as playing a role. There's something called the biopsychosocial model, which people may have heard about, but even within that, and it's sometimes referred to as the bio model, because in reality, the social bit is at best seen as secondary to a primary condition within the brain. So it's a model that's been on and off influential, developed initially by the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, and has been in the early 20th century and has shaped psychiatry in particular very much over that period. And I should begin to say that the attractions of seeing mental distress in that way, I think, are not all that hard to see. If you are experiencing very difficult feelings, if you're very, very anxious, and or if you are hearing voices or whatever, then to be given a diagnosis and told that this is what's wrong with you, some people find that very helpful in terms of giving some sense of control over what is going on. And others, not surprisingly, families, but also individuals, and we may want to talk about this in the discussion, but some people clearly find the medication, whether it's antidepressants or antipsychotic medication, can be helpful in terms of dealing with it. Helpful primarily, it should be said, particularly in relation to psychotic conditions, in dampening down symptoms. Ardney Lang tells the story of one of the patients that he was working with who, to damp down his voices, was given antipsychotic medication and would then walk about the ward shouting, "Speak up, you bastards, I can't hear you." So there's clearly pros and cons. So some people may find it helpful, but maybe the most powerful reason for seeing mental distress in that way. And it was an argument that was put forward very powerfully by the Marxist Peter Sedgwick in his book Psychopolitics. And I think it's an important argument, is that generally, while people may occasionally argue glad to be mad, for most people having a mental health condition is pretty hellish. It's pretty hellish. It's not fun. And therefore, recognising the seriousness of these conditions, I think, is important. And particularly at the moment, I mean, and again, this may be something we look at in the discussion. There are sections of the left which argue that we should be literally anti-psychiatry. One recent book argues we should argue for the closure of psychiatric services, etc. That doesn't seem to me a good argument. Particularly at a time when mental health services are already been slashed, whatever their limitations, and there are limitations, but at a time when people, particularly in England actually, are frequently forced to travel hundreds of miles to get a bed when they're having a psychiatric crisis, it seems to me that whatever the limitations of existing services, we fight to defend them while arguing for better, more user-controlled services. So that may be seen as some of the positives of the medical model. Having said that, I think there's some very, very powerful arguments against seeing conditions like depression or anxiety, and also conditions like schizophrenia simply as illnesses. And here I just want to touch on four. And the first and most obvious argument is that there are no physical markers for mental illness or mental distress. So if my doctor thinks I have angina or diabetes or whatever, then she can do blood tests, she can do various kind of tests to check out whether or not, in fact, I have such a condition. By contrast, there is no evidence for such markers within mental distress. If we look at what remains the most common theory of depression, for example, which is essentially chemical imbalance theory, which argues that it's primarily due to a lack of a chemical called serotonin in the brain. It's essentially derived from the fact that giving people serotonin, it's argued, and it's debatable, but argues that their mood improves when they're given serotonin-boosting drugs. As a critical psychiatrist, Joanna Moncrieff has argued, it's a wee bit like arguing that if I have a drink of beer and I feel more relaxed, then the lack of relaxation anxiety is due to a lack of alcohol in my brain. Or if I have a headache and I take aspirin, then that's due to the lack of aspirin in the brain. It's a kind of phony argument, and actually no one has demonstrated the serotonin theory of depression. And essentially the same is true of genetic theory. I see John Parrington here, so when he comment on this. But on a very, very regular basis, newspapers tend to proclaim that scientists have discovered or are about to discover the schizophrenic gene, the depressive gene, or whatever. We saw it here's a Guardian headline from a month ago: gene breakthrough raises hope for better depression treatment. Absolutely fine. The article then concludes, from the leading scientists involved in it, there are 44 variants linked to depression. We know that thousands of genes are involved in depression, with each having a very modest effect on a person's risk. There's certainly no single gene for depression. More generally, I think there's a wider acceptance amongst geneticists that while, I mean, to state the obvious, it would be strange if genes did not play some role in our mental makeup or whatever, but it's actually much more complex than that. And similarly, nor has anyone found either the depressive gene or the schizophrenic gene. The current state of research was summarised in 2013 by David Kupfer, who was the chair of the DSM task force, who essentially write the Bible on psychiatric diagnosis. So in 2013, Kupfer argued, in the future, we hope to be able to identify disorders using biological and genetic markers that provide for precise diagnosis that can be delivered with complete reliability and validity. Yet this promise, which we have anticipated in the 1970s, remains disappointingly distant. We've been telling patients for several decades that we're waiting for biomarkers. We are still waiting. Okay, so that basically is where that's at, and the same lack of evidence tends to affect when we move on to talk about the treatments for some of these conditions. People may have seen, for example, a recent pretty heavily hyped research report which argued that actually what the studies proved was that antidepressants are effective, that antidepressants work, and that lots more of us should be taking them. The authors of the report argued the problem at the moment was that 1 million more people in the UK should be taking antidepressants than are currently taking. At the moment, 9% of people in the UK take antidepressants. Now, again, it's an area for discussion. Many people take antidepressants. Many people find them helpful. And that's absolutely fine. If people find them helpful in maintaining themselves or whatever, that's absolutely fine. I think we have to balance that against saying there are some arguments which cast doubt on just how useful they are as a response to depression. So first of all, the issue of effectiveness, as critics of that report pointed out, there's a very strong placebo effect. The effectiveness is actually quite limited. Just to give one example, not that long ago, in the 1980s and 1990s, the discovery of Prozac and similar drugs was hailed as a massive breakthrough in the treatment of depression. I remember reading books like Prozac Nation and so on, which hailed it as a life-changing drug. Financially, Prozac was the most successful drug ever. It netted $2.6 billion a year for its manufacturer, Eli Lilly. And it's interesting to read what the most recent report, the report I just cited, says about Prozac, because what it said, the Guardian report on it, commenting on it, the most famous antidepressant of them all, Prozac, was found to be one of the least effective, right, of these drugs, but best tolerated. Measured by a low dropout rate in the trials of fewer side effects reported. So in other words, it wasn't very effective, but it didn't have terrible side effects, so people continued to take it. By contrast, the most effective of the drugs, amitriptyline, was the 6th best tolerated. And again, that's interesting, because amitriptyline is a drug that was actually, it's one of the earliest antidepressants that was discovered in the 1950s, right? So it may be the most effective, but people giving up taking it within a fairly short period because the side effects are so unpleasant. And I think that highlights a second problem with antidepressants, which is often minimized, namely the side effects. A 2014 study by John Reed found that more than half of the people involved reported emotional numbing, sexual difficulties, increased suicidality, etc., etc. So if people find these helpful, that's absolutely fine. But I think what we also have to recognize that much of the hype surrounding them has been driven by the fact that until recently, the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, has been probably the most profitable industry in the world, whose concern is not with our health, our mental health, but purely with profits. Ironically, because they're no longer able to make these profits, they are now withdrawing from the production of antidepressants. So there are arguments both with understanding about the argument that mental distress is primarily about what happens in our brain, but the main argument, I think, and this is what I mainly want to speak on for the remainder of the talk, is that it ignores what is now a very, very powerful body of evidence which highlights that the roots of mental distress lie primarily not in our brains, but in the kind of society we live in. Just to qualify that in a couple of ways, I'm assuming a distinction here, but maybe I just need to spell out that there are certain conditions which are described as organic conditions, for example, such as epilepsy or dementia or whatever, which clearly have a material basis in the brain. So that's what's referred to by that. Psychiatrists and others then refer to what are usually called functional conditions, which is like schizophrenia and anxiety. And these are the ones which I'm mainly talking about today. And what is also true, and I think, again, it's important to say this, that one of the major problems with that view of that, if you like, biomedical view of mental distress is actually what it often fails to recognize is the fact that the brain is also social, right? In other words, that what happens in our lives and in our experiences actually shapes the function and actually the structure of the brain. Just to give a short quote from the neuroscientist Bruce Wexler, who says, as well as having the longest period during which brain growth is shaped by the environment, human beings alter the environment in ways that shape their brains to a degree without precedent among animals. It's this ability to shape the environment and that in turn shapes our brains that has allowed human adaptability and capability to develop at a much faster rate than is possible through alteration of the genetic code. And in addition, there is now the field of study known as epigenetics, which looks at how environmental factors and social factors can turn genes on and off, etc., etc. So the problem with the biological model of the brain is not that our brains don't matter or don't count, but actually it neglects the extent to which our brains are also shaped by a whole range of factors, from poor nutrition to the impact of trauma, factors that affect the development and the operation of the brains. And there's now a very large body of evidence, in particular, which has emerged over the past decade or so, some from the service user movement, a lot from critical psychiatrists and critical psychologists and so on, which highlight the role that childhood abuse and early life trauma, but not just childhood factors, also factors such as bullying, racism, and so on, how these factors make people more vulnerable to mental health problems. I'll just say as an aside, for those who are interested, a lot of that evidence has been brought together very recently in a very, very useful publication by the British Psychological Society, which is called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. 450 pages long, but free online as a PDF. I think it's an excellent, there are problems with this approach, which is basically based on Foucault and notions of power, but I think in terms of bringing together all the available evidence around it, I think it's really, really worth reading. And essentially, if there's a core message that emerges from that literature, essentially it is that we are not born with mental distress. We are not born with the problems that we have as adults, but rather they arise out of our life experience and our interactions with others. As one author puts it, it's the bad things that happen to you that drive you crazy. Okay, and that's the central thesis of that publication. Moving it on a bit, however, and from our point of view, the key thing is many of the bad things that happen to us are not random. They're not random, but rather they're shaped by the divisions within capitalist society. So just to run through some of them, for example, over 50 years of research has consistently demonstrated that there has consistently found higher rates of schizophrenia and other forms of psychosis for Afro-Caribbean people living in the UK. It's not true if you're an Afro-Caribbean person living in Jamaica or Trinidad or whatever, but actually moving to the UK, suggesting that the main factor is the pressures of racism. In terms of gender, similar but more complex picture in some ways. What the most recent figures show is that women are 2 to 3 times more likely than men to meet the diagnostic criteria for conditions like anxiety or depressive disorders. Men, however, are more likely to kill themselves. So there you are. But I think a consistent finding also, a key consistent finding from the research, is that the main determinant of mental distress is poverty and class. Okay, so a major British study published in 2008 followed 10,000 people from their birth in 1958, found that those who were poor at the age of 7 were significantly more likely by the age of 45 to have experienced a range of mental health problems. And that's a very consistent finding. There's a classic study in the 1950s by 2 Americans, Hollingshead and Redlich, which found the same thing. Brown and Harris, in their study of depression in women in the 70s, found the same thing. So it's a consistent study that runs all the way through, that it's class that primarily shapes your chances of becoming mentally distressed. To bring it up to date a little bit, more recently, there's an emerging body of research, which I think is very useful, from writers like, some of you may be familiar with the book The Spirit Level, writers like Richard Wilkinson, Kate Pickett, and Inequality. Recent book, which is worth a look, by Johann Hari, the independent journalist, called Lost Connections, which actually argues many of the same things that I do in my own book. And people like George Monbiot, who have highlighted the role of social isolation, breakdown in social networks, and so on, in particular the impact of neoliberal capitalism over the past 3 decades on mental distress. I think in many ways, it's certainly in my view, that research is extremely useful, and we should use it, and it represents a major advance, I think, on biomedical approaches. Having said which, I think it suffers from 2 quite important limitations. The first is that while all of these writers refer to class, they tend to see class as just one more division amongst others, no more, no less important than any of the others. And even less frequently do they even begin to conceive of the working class as a force for change in society. So, for example, the subtitle of the spirit level of Wilson Pickett is why equality is better for everyone. Okay, so essentially it's an argument that the rich as well as the poor should be interested in creating. Essentially, we're all in this together. But secondly, and I think also importantly, what that view also leads to is a view of neoliberalism, which is shared by most of them, which tends to see neoliberalism as essentially a set of values, an ideology, what one view calls a story, and that basically, if only the government adopt a different set of values or a different story or a different narrative or whatever, we simply just, or even better, get back to the Keynesian policies of the post-war period, and everything would be okay. And I think as Marxists, our starting point is very, very different, because the division of society into a tiny minority, the 1% who basically dominate the world versus the rest of us, it is that division, which is not just a static division, essentially the exploitation of the 99% by the global ruling class is the engine which drives the global system. It's not just yet another division. It's actually it's the accumulation that underpins that is what drives capitalism, and as Marx argued, which gives rise to a never-ending struggle between exploiters and exploited. And I think if we start from that position, and that leads to a different understanding, that understanding of class and class struggle leads to a different understanding of neoliberalism, which sees it not simply as an ideology or as a set of values, but primarily as a ruling class response to the end of the long boom in the 1970s and to the crisis of profitability is exposed. And essentially, again, quite an important argument within the book is that response, a response that involves slashing welfare, weakening trade union organisation, increasing marketisation, privatisation, forcing workers to compete against each other at quality to a new level that we are paying for with our mental health. Okay, if we want to understand why we have seen such a huge increase in levels of mental distress and mental ill health over the past 20, 30 years, then actually it's to be found in these policies. And just to give some examples, for example, if we look at the figures I mentioned earlier, the huge levels of mental distress among children and young people, is very closely linked to increased competition, whether it's SATs in schools, whether it's in universities or whatever. A study that came out in May this year, NSPCC reported that the number of education settings seeking professional mental help for kids went up by more than a third in the last 3 years. And shockingly, more than half of referrals from the settings in England for mental health treatment in the last 3 years were from primary schools. Okay. Coupled with that is the relentless individualism, often in the name of promoting independence, that has underpinned neoliberalism, core element of neoliberalism, which along with cuts since 2008 to community-based services are also contributing to the current epidemic in social isolation, loneliness, etc., which is reckoned to be equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Thirdly, there is the impact of austerity on mental health. And here it's a double whammy, because on the one hand, what we have seen everywhere is significant increase, since 2010, significant increases in the rates of mental ill health, depression. In Greece, for example, Greece in 2008 had one of the lowest levels of suicide in Europe. Greece now has one of the highest levels of suicide in Europe. But it's a double whammy in the sense that while that mental distress is increasing, at the same time we are seeing massive cuts to mental health services. The fourth element in the ways in which neoliberal policies have contributed to the increase is through the intensification of work, the fact that we are all now having to work much harder than we did 20, 30 years ago, increased exploitation. So it's maybe not surprising that in 2015 and 2016, stress accounted for 37% of all work-related ill health cases, 45% of all working days lost due to ill health. And in large part, that's about what Marx, of course, classically described as alienation, the lack of control over work. But it's not simply about, partly about people having to work harder, but it's also about the crushing of creativity, of why people come into the jobs in the first place. As the chair mentioned, one of the things that I've been involved in is setting up the Social Work Action Network. We called our first meeting to launch the network, I didn't come into social work for this, right? One of my mates who's a teacher, an education lecturer, then wrote a chapter called I Didn't Come Into Education for This, right? And you could talk about nursing, you could talk about medicine, talk about every other field where people come in because they want to make change, etc. So on the one hand, the increased exploitation, the intensification, on the other hand, the crushing of people's aspirations and their creativity. But in finishing, I want to say that imposition of that increased exploitation brings me to the final reason for what I want to argue is underpins the current epidemic of mental distress, because the massive growth in the level of mental distress that we've seen over the past 30 years has taken place against a background of a very low level of class struggle. Not because workers haven't wanted to fight. I'm sure many of us here in 2011 were involved in the fantastic pension strike, but because on every occasion our leaders our trade union leaders have run away from that struggle. So maybe, and I think to me this seems a crucial factor in understanding why people are suffering so much just now. And I just want to quote from a journalist, Guardian journalist called Tim Adams, who was attending a conference on stress. And I think what Adams says is very interesting. He says this. He said, the more I listened, the more it seemed that the mental health of individuals had become the battleground and what might once have involved broader standoffs. It was tempting to think that the front line of labour disputes had shifted from picket lines to worry lines, and that collective grievances had become individual psychological battles. In the 1980s, an average of 7,213,000 working days were lost each year to strikes. That number fell to 647,000 between 2010 and 2015. Meanwhile, the days lost to stress-related illness went exponentially in the other direction, including a 30% increase in occupational stress. Stress seems to be standing in for older concepts like injustice, inequality and frustration seen at the level of the wider workforce. In other words, when we don't fight, when we accept whatever shit, or when our trade union leaders accept whatever shit is thrown at us by management, then we feel depressed and anxious. When people do fight back, however, they feel less alone and more powerful. So if there's a message from the book, it's that fighting back is actually very, very good for our mental health. And I think we see that, and we can quote the classic example, which some people know, some people won't, from Poland. Colin Barker quotes it, that when the trade union solidarity was rising in the early 80s in Poland, the psychiatric hospitals emptied of the workers who were in them and filled up with the Communist Party bureaucrats, right? Because people began to get a sense of their own power. But actually, I think we can see it at a smaller scale, but actually much more recently. If we look at the experience of workers during the recent UCU strike, right, when people were on the picket line for 14 days, they begin to get a sense not only of their own power, but also in terms of challenging alienation. Just to give one quote from a UCU striker and socialist worker, a lot of us have been saying that the university on strike is more like a university than it is when we aren't on strike. We actually have time to talk to each other. It's exciting. There's so many debates around, and people get back in touch with their own creativity and their own power. So we fight back to defend services, to fight for better services, but also because it's good for us. And I just want to finish on one thing, because fighting to defend services is crucial, but actually I think as socialists we have to go beyond that. And I just want to end with a quote from a book I've already mentioned, which is a marvellous book, well worth a read, by George Brown and Tyrrell Harris, called Social Origins of Depression. It's a study of depression in women. And the conclusion is for those of you who are interested in social science methods, it's one of the most meticulously conducted studies that I'm aware of. And the conclusion of Brown and Harris is that while we see sadness, unhappiness and grief as inevitable in all societies, we do not believe this is true of clinical depression. In other words, there is absolutely nothing natural, there is absolutely nothing inevitable about the current level of emotional misery that is actually going on in society. It is a product of a society based on alienation, based on the denial of our most basic human needs. And so, yes, we fight for better services, but we also have to fight, I think, for what Eric Fromm called a sane society, I think what we would call a socialist society.
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much, Iain. That's fantastic. And for me, what is so important is that we have people like you and many other socialists challenging the norm that a pill cures all. And this is my 35th year of nursing, and but general nursing. But when I was in my third year, I did psychiatry, and I was grappling with ideas around another way as possible, and used to ask why we were sending somebody who'd been sectioned back to the same shithole flat where she thought her neighbours were attacking her, and was told that I had a hang-up on cure and I should look at mental illness like diabetes. But I also wanted to say that, I know you're not covering every ill health possible, but in general nursing and health, the idea that you just throw tablets at everything horrifies me. I think people think, anyway, I mean, I don't know that I'm respected enough for my views. My mum was on 14 tablets before she died, while I kept trying to talk to the doctors about the fact that my mum and myself were understanding it was the end of her life, and did she really have to? I mean, a couple of them thought that was refreshing, but others didn't actually even understand that I wanted to have that conversation. I work on a cancer ward where I was looking after a 91-year-old recently who again was coming to the end of his life, and I was just with him, sitting with him, giving him a drink, and he was in agony, and I just held on to his hand and, sort of stroked where the pain was, or did old-fashioned nursing, as I call it. And other people would run off and get some opiates, and he said to me, "Thank you for taking away my pain." And the point is, I think, that what he needed was somebody just to be with him and feel that human contact, and to feel looked after and taken care of in a real sense. On a very last point, just this popped into my head, sorry if this sounds mad, but when I was buying guinea pigs, as you do as a parent of growing up children, maybe other people don't, but I give in to everything they ask for, including guinea pigs. I went to buy one, and this stranger said, "You can't buy one, they're social animals, you've got to buy two." So of course I did. I've nursed 4 guinea pigs to death, and then I thought, my neighbour tried to kill himself 3 years ago. He's 95. He has got nobody or anything. Probably nobody's even diagnosed Len with a mental health disorder. He's bloody 98. He has such a miserable life. I'd like to put all the sad teenagers with people like Len and let people really see the beauty in human relationships, and another world is possible, and we have to fight for that.
I wanted to congratulate Iain really on his book, because I think it's a fantastic intervention into what I think is a huge, huge issue in Britain and internationally. And I think, not being crude, it is a very deep class issue. A few years ago, I was a branch secretary of a local government unison branch, and I would say on those individual cases, probably 80% of the people you represented in some shape or form was connected to mental health. Usually about bullying management, people who are under stress, and the stress levels now involving layers of workers who perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago weren't under the cosh, are now, I think, at epidemic proportions. And I think what that means is that intervention like Iain's book makes sense to a lot of people. The concept of alienation, which in one sense is, we talk about Marxist philosophy, makes sense to, I think, when you talk to people, to ordinary working class people, as an explanation about what underpins mental distress. And in Bristol, where I live, there is a, like in everywhere, there is a deep, deep crisis of mental health services. There are deep crisis around children's mental health services, in which the length of time young people have to wait to access therapies or be seen is scandalous. It's utterly scandalous what's taking place. And in Bristol University, people may have read, they've had a series of terrible, tragic young students committing suicide. But what the students did in exam season was to have a demonstration, put very, very concrete demands, and they got 600-700 students on the street saying, "We're not going to put up with it anymore. We're not going to let people be isolated isolated in their own, these young students are living in shoeboxes, aren't they? Cut off from people, under extreme pressure. And I got a 13-year-old son. When I look at the education system, I'm surprised more kids don't go under. It is barbaric what's happened to young people in schools. They are churned in, battered, and the idea of having joy in education seems to be completely alien to the system that we deliver. The last point, and perhaps a question I want to raise it in, on the question of child mental health, and young people, there has been an explosion of self-harm. The figures are going off the Richter scale, but it is heavily towards young women. My understanding is that the male figure, boys, it's sort of plateaued. But for young women, is off the Richter scale. So there is an issue around that. And I guess I was trained. It was an indicator, often, not always, self-harm, of some serious childhood trauma and often sexual abuse. Not always. I wouldn't be crude about it. But now we are going through an epidemic of self-harm. And I wonder what your explanation is around the question of gender and its implications. But I think for us as revolutionaries, and there is an opportunity to collectivize the distress. What I mean by that is, I absolutely agree. When I was in the union stuff, it was the management wanted, you're the individual problem. You can't cope. We might give you some support to deal with the issue. We have to say, the problem is you, the management, and collectively we have to resist and make that a working class issue we can fight on.
Okay. So after this comrade will be the comrade with the blonde hair and the sunglasses towards the back. I'm not sure if she's oh yeah. So you're going to be after John, and then comrade towards the back.
Yeah, John Parrington from Oxford. Yeah, I wanted to say a bit more about the role of biology, because I think the speaker gave a great introduction really about the importance of society and social pressures in mental distress. But I think actually we can actually learn a lot from what's going on at the moment in research about the biology of the brain, how that relates to this distress, because it's quite clear there's no simple link between either society or biology and mental distress. But actually there's a very interesting, sophisticated interaction going on there. And it's quite clearly that all the genetic analysis that's been trying to find schizophrenia genes or depression genes is not turning up anything of the sort. But what it is finding is clues about how biology and social pressure might interact. For instance, studies of certain types of people with schizophrenia have indicated that if you've got some specific genetic difference, and you also spoke a lot of cannabis as a teenager, that may be more of a trigger than in some other people. And that kind of gives a sense of the way that any kind of social stress might actually have an impact that's slightly different in different people. And it's I think one of the biggest problems we face really in what has been done in the study of the brain is how crude the models of how brain function is, and how that relates to being a social being, a self-aware, conscious social being. Because actually the speaker spoke about the role of, we're learning about epigenetics. This is this idea that the environment can influence the genome in much more kind of direct ways than we thought. What I think we're learning from these studies is just how heterogeneous some of these conditions are. So there's probably no such thing as schizophrenia or depression per se. And also how society and social pressures can really interact epigenetically. So there is evidence that the interesting evidence about things like schizophrenia is that there may be a role for inflammation in the brain. So there is a biological thing going on there, but that's affected by the kind of social pressures, trauma, that kind of things that is talked about. And again, that could be quite different in different people. Could explain, for instance, why Afro-Caribbeans in this country are 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Of course, that could also be a racist thing about being diagnosed because you are Afro-Caribbean. We've got to think about that other alternative. But I think what's really exciting about looking at how social struggle can really affect things is by looking at examples from the past. Like, for instance, in the French Revolution, there was a figure there called Thérèse de Méricourt. Actually ended up in a lunatic asylum. And yet she played this incredibly important role in the French Revolution. So, was it that she was already on the verge of mental illness, or was it that her character, you know, in the French Revolution had a very different kind of role, that's an inspiring figure, kind of fiery figure. She inspired people, but when the French Revolution went down, then she kind of lost her mind. And I think we can learn a lot from the way that after the Russian Revolution, mental illness, mental distress was treated. I ain't got time to go into what Vygotsky said about how we can understand, say, schizophrenia, but what was a big thing is the way that he dealt with children with disabilities, but also children who had been traumatized by the Civil War. And the essence of it all came down to the treating people, I'm going up on this, treating people as having potential and having so much to give to society, rather than just labeling people as ill or useless.
Hi, I was really, really pleased to hear Iain talk about the power threat meaning framework. I just wanted to say a little bit more about what is involved in that, but as well as to kind of maybe open up a wider discussion about what it is and what our approach should be to it, really, as Marxists, which I haven't thought through, but it's just an invitation, actually, because I think one of the things that happens within the academy is that we have people working on biology, we have people working on psychology, we have people working in social work parts, that can be very, very separated out, and actually, there's quite a good opportunity using the Marxist methods to bring those different levels of analysis together, and actually the power threat meaning framework is not a bad starting point. So it's been put together by a very sort of leading service users and a lot of critical psychologists. So people like Eleanor Longden, Jackie Dillon, John Reed, Richard Bentle, etc., people like that, basically. And what it says is we should replace, I'm reading this from the documents, as Iain said, you can download it. So it says that we should be replacing the question, which is the kind of very medical formulation of mental distress, which is what is wrong with you, with 4 others, which are what has happened to you. So how has power operated in your life? How did it affect you? So what kinds of threats did this pose? What sense did you make of it? What was the meaning of these situations and experiences to you? And what did you need to do to survive? So what kinds of threat response are you using to deal with this? There's an emerging, I think, critique of it, just from discussions that I'm aware of, about whether that model isn't, whether it takes enough account, really, of things like the impacts of welfare reform, some of the more social kind of forces. But I do think it's something that's a good, I think we want to be a kind of critical friend to that document, actually, and kind of think about how to advance it. I think that's really important. Just another couple of points, really, and it gets back to the question of how biological and how do we integrate biology into... And I think the example that John uses is really, really interesting. So the example of cannabis use, as far as just the literature I've read, suggests that one of the things that's quite difficult is it's hard to separate out whether young men that are using cannabis, whether that's the primary factor, or whether it's the fact that actually people then get into patterns of quite a lot of dislocation from the rest of the world around them, because they're up quite a lot of the night, they're asleep a lot of the day, and the social isolation, poverty, all of those kinds of other factors that are in the background there. And I think specifically with cannabis research, one of the things I think is really, really interesting is there will be a lot of people so mental health circles, people will talk about cannabis use as a trigger. What they don't research is the numbers of people who regularly use cannabis but actually don't make their way into mental health systems. So you end up with quite a kind of skewed representation of the question, really. So I think in all of these, and it just draws, again, I suppose, attention to the fact that all of these questions are very, very complex. And I think there's a role for us as an organisation to actually make quite a big difference there by thinking across disciplines and in different kinds of ways.
Okay, after this, comrade, the Marxism team person, and...
Just really another encouragement to read Iain's book. I think it's a very difficult subject to write about, and to write about it simply without being crude and simplistic is a very difficult thing to do, and I think it's quite amazing that Iain squeezed so much into such a small book, so I really would highly recommend it. I work as a disability advisor in higher education, and you'll probably all have read stuff in the headlines recently about the crisis in mental health among students. I'll tell you when that happens most, but when we get the most business, and that's around exams time. So anybody that tells you it's about, individual brains and anything like the rest of it, well, there's a simple answer for you. I'll tell you something else that I found out a while back, and that was Pfizer. Pfizer's the Swiss pharmaceutical company, megabucks. And in 1952, Pfizer decided that there was no purpose for them in developing the new antidepressant, which had been identified for the simple reason, in their view, that there was no market for it. No, for goodness sakes, you think back, 1952, no market for antidepressants. Now it's probably one of the most profitable industries in the world, pumping antidepressants for people. China's a new market, apparently, where, a few years ago they said there was no depression in China because, you see, it's a socialist country. You can't have depression in a socialist country. And now, of course, you're finding the rates of antidepressant sales in China absolutely going through the roof week by week. And, we all know the reasons for that. And they're the same reasons, really, that drive the crisis in mental health in this country. There's two aspects to what Iain said I just wanted to add a little bit to. The first is about neoliberalism. I think it's very, very important that Iain stressed the whole thing about epidemic and linking it to neoliberalism, but the other aspect of it is something else that I know he's very passionate about, and that's the whole question of capitalism as a whole. In other words, alienation. The way in which the very bedrock of our humanity is undermined by the character of the way in which we're supposed to assert our humanity, working on the environment in order to change it. In other words, the world of work. The world of work is at the centre of the crisis for many people's mental health. If you think about it another way, right, today, right, I mean, this is just, again, going back to the neoliberal theory. One of the big new trendy things is well-being, right? Well-being at work. I can hear everybody nodding around it, right? So it's very simple. As you get more bullied, as you get more driven at work, as you get more shat on, then basically the answer is what you need to do a bit of yoga at lunchtime and then come back to be bullied and overworked and done in once more. And then you get back on, the wonderful picture on the front of the book is so appropriate, isn't it? Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times is a very good analogy, and you get sucked into the machine and he's going round and grinding round and all the rest of it. And he's on the machine, the assembly line, and he comes off the assembly line, and he's still going like this with the nuts, tightening the nuts, because he's completely screwed up with the whole process. So I think that's a really, really important part of it. Two minor points I've got time. The first is that we will still have mental health difficulties in a socialist society because we're still going to break up. People are still going to die. All sorts of horrible things are still going to happen. But the point is that that's not driven by the type of society we live in. That's the reality of being a human being, right? The problem that we have is that you think of anybody that's got anxiety and depression, it's very simple, right? What's the problem? Maybe they've lost their job. Maybe they've split up with a partner. Maybe they've lost their home. Maybe they're unemployed. Maybe they're getting bullied at work. But every time people get over these things, what is it that changes the situation? The situation. It's a change in the situation that makes people better, isn't it? So the point is that, all these arguments about genetics, I think, are all very well, and it's important to engage with them, but that's the froth on the pint. The pint is, it's a society that needs to change, and it's a fight for society that drives better mental health. To put it very crudely, capitalism has fucked up the world. Our job is to unfuck the world.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the user-led movement. I've recently become involved in an organisation, which is a mental health charity, which is user-led. And it's quite interesting hearing the other comrade before talking about these things like well-being. And I see a real contradiction within this service, because I do think it's a brilliant service, and you can see how it helps people. But again, there's this contradiction because they acknowledge that it's people's lived kind of environments which cause problems, because it's very much a recovery-based service. It's about changing maybe parts of your housing which are difficult, or addressing difficult relationships and things like that. But again, there is this contradiction where it's kind of individualized. But I really want to stress the importance actually of this service, and actually it's a volunteer-led organisation, which is obviously not the way forward, because people should not have to kind of volunteer their own time when people time is very precious. But someone said at the beginning about it's about human relationships, and I think that's what you see in these kind of user-led movements, is actually people can overcome, or not overcome, but they can manage their mental distress actually by connecting with people and by having that kind of shared experience. And I know we, as the working class, talk about class unity, and something which gets talked a lot is the kind of unity of experience. And the common experience of suffering from mental distress and understanding what that's like. And I'd just like to kind of hear a little bit more about how mental health services would look like under socialism, because obviously, you know, mental stress would still exist.
Okay, so after this comrade is going to be woman with the pink t-shirt. Yeah, on that side. Yeah. If people can make it shorter than 3 minutes, that would be great, because we've got quite a lot more people wanting to speak.
Hello, my name is Paul Burnham. I wanted to talk about the politics of the mind in relation to class consciousness, starting with understanding somebody that I think we do need to look at, Sigmund Freud, because to my mind, Freud, non-Marxist and anti-Marxist though he was, put a number of things on the table that I think are really important for us to understand. In that, Freud, in his attempts to treat neurotics and hysterics, went back to normal behaviour, looked at normal behaviour, looked at the problems of normality, and you start to understand that it's not so normal, it's pretty weird. Looking at, as we all know, dreams. Almost everybody dreams, and the dreams that we have are bizarre, they appear to be irrational, but I believe, I think it's, you know, that we can understand that there are real and rational desires within that bizarre behaviour, which is what it is. Also, Freud examined, of course, went back to the process of the development of the human personality from the earliest stages. When we're born, we don't have a developed mind, we don't have a developed personality. There is a process of development, which is a contradictory process of development, which often goes somewhat wrong. So Freud's followers of today, people like, in later years, people like John Bowlby, for example, would look at secure attachment. And it is argued, it is believed that 60% of adults achieve secure attachment and 40% of us do not achieve secure attachment in developed societies. So who's more normal, the 60% or the 40%? I mean, it really takes us somewhere. And I think that, therefore, I believe that every human being has a conscious mind and an unconscious mind, and that those contradictions go on. So what's the significance of that for socialists? On the other side of the piece of paper. Well, yes, thank you. Well, the significance of all that is that we face a world that is incredibly contradictory, and if you engage in politics, politics is never just about the numbers, never just about the arguments, never just about the facts. It's always about a subjectivity. I mean, you know, many years ago when I entered the engineering industry, I saw this amazing class conflict that was going on. I saw this amazing level of class consciousness, trade union membership and voting labour, and of course tremendous non-achievement of socialism, because people had all kinds of other priorities and other ideas. And the more you talk to people, the more you can learn, but it doesn't necessarily take us much further. And we have to find a way to engage with that subjectivity, I believe. Because, you know, but the question is, what do people, many of us who are active socialists, do in talking to people who are not active socialists, who don't agree with us, who agree in part, and so on, and what can we learn from those people?
Okay, I'm afraid I've only got time for 2 more people from the floor before an announcement. So after this comrade, it's going to be, comrade there, and then I'm really sorry to everyone else, because there's been lots of people wanting to speak, and it's been a great discussion.
Hello, I work at CAMS, and you know, we've obviously within CAMS and within all mental health services at the moment. I mean, it's a pretty it's an awful situation. You know, we've got young people being sent up to Scotland from London because there are no beds in the south. You know, it is pretty awful. And, you know, what's becoming, I think, more apparent is that, you know, we are more and more reliant on drugs. You know, our psychiatrists, our doctors doling out more drugs because, we lack the staff, we lack the therapists. And, so we've got more children sort of, I think, diagnosed like with ADHD, because within classrooms, children are expected at a younger and younger age to just sort of sit there, not to play, as children should be doing, but just to sit there and absorb and sort of more, rote learning, I think. And so, this diagnosis of ADHD, which I kind of really question, where children are then given Ritalin, I think is very problematic. And as people have said, more young people, highly stressed, self-harming. I do think, in terms of girls and self-harm, I think this is, about women's oppression, about, feeling of powerlessness, and it's a communication. It's about pain and finding that hard to communicate. I agree with the previous comrade about Freud. I think Freud talked about the different levels. He talked about the unconscious, the consciousness, the ego and the superego. I think you can liken that to Marx's ideas around levels that Marx talked about. And I think there are psychoanalysts who have gone on to develop Freud's ideas. So I think we can look to understand, say, like racism, how racism is about splitting, is about seeing, the good, splitting into the good and bad, and wanting to about the other. So, I think, we can have a dialogue. I just want to say lastly, within my service, we led a campaign. As the union rep, I led the campaign at work against the cuts. And I think within the next few years, we will see more and more cuts. This was by a Labour council because we get a £1 million top-up. We won our campaign. We won it with our service users. It was a united campaign with the whole community. We had public meetings. We lobbied the councillors, and we said this is about our future. This is about our young people's future. This is about all our mental health, and we need to change things for the better. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, you can. I think the key question is probably who are the services for? And it's we don't ask the question of service users, what type of services would you like in general? Or if you do, it's within a format of 5 questions in one row, and you have to tick the boxes to ensure that it fits in with the form that management have sent down. And one of the things that, just as a story about that, there are 5 health boards in Ireland, and in one of the health boards there are just 2 child psychiatrists. The 2 child psychiatrists are now in their 4th year of suspension on full pay. Therefore, there are no child psychiatrists whatsoever in that health board area anymore. And the reason they're on suspension on full pay is because they refused to continually supply Ritalin to children under a certain age. They wanted to treat them for a longer period. They were told by the health boards that wasn't cost effective. Therefore, they had to continue to give the Ritalin. They refused to do so. And they were told that they were the ones creating the problem on the basis that they were creating longer waiting lists, that the costs were much higher, etc., etc. So essentially, I think the baseline is what we've been talking about here, is what is the purpose of the health services and who are they for? And that's really the baseline of the fight that we're talking about.
Thank you. Right.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for all the contributions. Just to try and go through them. And Hugh's point, gender and self-harm, I can't give a definitive answer, and people may have other thoughts on it. The suggestion by people like Monbiot and what's the one, is it Ryan Crossley, another Guardian journalist, is it's linked to the pressures of young women in social media. Now that may be true, but it's certainly the case, as Hugh quite rightly says. Self-harm, there's now a general acceptance that self-harm has a meaning, right, and that it's often a way for young people to relieve very, very, very powerful, painful feelings or whatever, sometimes, but not always, linked to forms of abuse. There has undoubtedly been an increase in it, which mainly affects young women. I think there's maybe a more general point here, which is a number, and I do try and emphasise it in the book, is, and it's not a cop-out, but the complexity of mental distress, right? And we can generalise, but so for example, in the 1990s, there was an epidemic of suicide among young men in Scotland. when suicide was going down in England and elsewhere, it was increasing very, very rapidly. So I think, on the one hand, I think we have to look very concretely at the specific factors in each case. It does seem to me that it's probably linked to increased competition among young, increased feelings of insecurity, vulnerability, etc. But other people may have more concrete thoughts on that. In terms of John's contribution about biology and schizophrenia, I mean, the starting point quite clearly is we are materialists, right? So quite clearly, where, you know, if people, you know, clearly what we ingest into our bodies, whether it's not enough food or whether it's alcohol or whether it's cannabis or whatever, is going to have an impact on our bodies and on our brains. So it would be strange, and in fact, there's now, I'm sure you're aware of it, but there's now a very, very substantial body of evidence for people like John Reid and others, and it's contained in the PTM framework, about the way in which, for example, early trauma actually shapes the structure and the development of the brain, right, in ways that are often recognised as being a symptom of schizophrenia. Right, so I think there's increasingly interesting research, and I think one of the best writers in the field, Richard Bentall, adduces a whole range of factors, including things like racism, bullying, all these things that have an emotional, psychological impact on us, also have an impact on the brain. I think some of the more interesting things that are happening in areas of genetics is exploring some of the more specific mechanisms of that. I think we have to be careful, because I think it can often be driven by the idea that, first of all, there is such a thing as schizophrenia, right? Schizophrenia is a concept, right? Bentall calls it a map. It's not a particularly good map. In the book, I look at the huge levels of disagreement across the globe. This is not to say there's no such thing as mental illness. Quite clearly, people hear voices, people experience hallucinations, etc. But the notion that there is a common thing called schizophrenia, which is somehow located in the brain, I think is open to question. And I do tend to, I think that, you know, clearly as Marxists, we are committed to science. These questions matter. However, I think, as Rory kind of alluded to, there's a huge imbalance in the amount of research spending on looking at these genetic things and the amount of spending on looking at social factors that cause it. And actually, it may be at some point and way down the line we'll find a specific genetic mechanism. The reality is, at the moment, we know that poverty, neglect, abuse, racism, bullying, in the here and now, make a difference, and therefore that's what I think we should be focusing on. In terms of Freud, I mean, I actually have a chapter discussing Freud in the book. I think we have to say that for most of its history, psychoanalysis as a practice has been mainly reactionary, has often contributed to women's oppression and so on and so forth. However, as I also argue in the book, there has always been within Marxism a current which has explored the radical kernel, if you like, of Freud's thought. And I think it's because essentially, for Freud, the concept of repression was very central. While to a large extent he believed that much of the repression was necessary in terms of the development of civilization, at the same time he was also highly critical of the degree of repressions, of sexual repression at his own period. I think a quote, I'm not going to here, but it's a very interesting discussion of fetishes, which I think is actually really, really significant in terms of how he understood sexuality and human sexuality as essentially imaginative, creative, etc. Also recognise some of the positive aspects of the Russian Revolution. But more generally, I think there's a tradition, particularly in Germany in the 20s and 30s, of Marxists who were also psychoanalysts, and I think that tradition is worth revisiting. I also think, and I'm not going to time to go into them here, but I think it's important that John and others are restating the importance of Vygotsky's idea. Lev Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist in the 20s. I think we have much to learn from that. So I think that's really good that is happening. I think in terms of services, Conrad asked what would services be like under socialism. So let me make some general points about that. The reality at the moment, precisely because of austerity, precisely because of the ongoing crisis, is that mental health services are becoming more controlling. So there's an increase in the number of people who have been sectioned. There's an increase in the number of community treatment orders. There's an increase in they're becoming more coercive. There's an increase in the use of electroconvulsive therapy. As a comrade said, there's an increase, they're becoming increasingly medicalised. I'm sure many GPs would love to have alternatives to antidepressants to offer people, what's sometimes called social prescribing, but the option is often not there. So that's the reality at the moment. In terms of what alternative services would look like, I think one positive development, and I've done a bit of research work over the past number of years in this area, but I think many of the ideas that have emerged from the service user movement, although it's patchy, fragile, etc., but it seems to me that developments like the Hearing Voices networks, which actually find ways in which people can find alternative ways of managing their voices, which are based on negotiating with them, etc., and also, I think, fundamentally recognising that mental distress has a meaning. It's not just a biochemical, it has a meaning. And that also means, and again, one very, very consistent finding from lots and lots of research, going back to Carol Rogers to the present day, is that actually what makes a difference in terms of helping people is the quality of relationship with the therapist. Okay, it's not particularly the method, not whatever, but actually a trusting relationship, etc., is really what counts. The problem is, as many social workers, psychotherapists, psychologists, and others know, there is less and less time for people to build these kind of relationships. There is less and less time for people to work in the ways that they know work. So that, and that's a challenge in that, but I think we have to fight for that. I thought the reaction to Rory's comments about well-being was very telling. I mean, it's interesting because people may or may not have noticed, but there was a letter in Socialist Review in response to the book from a guy who I think is a reverend somewhere, a minister, who said, the weakness of the book is that I don't talk about mindfulness. Now, I suspect we could have a whole big discussion on this, and again, I think we have to say many people, and there's evidence for this, that many people find mindfulness, meditation helpful, etc. But I think in the kind of general context we're living in, it's not surprising that we see that degree of cynicism when managements who are, really screwing people into the ground and then offer yoga classes at lunchtime. I think it's not surprising we see that kind of response. Last couple of points. I think, again, positive things. I think one big shift over the past 10, 20 years, and it's partly because of the rise of service users getting organised, and it's partly because of the developments within various professional fields, we are seeing a far higher degree of unity between service user groups, trade unions, groups like Social Work Action Network, groups like Psychologists Against Austerity. It's now a feature of, the comrade spoke about her own situation in Glasgow. We saw a tremendous campaign against cuts in Glasgow Association for Mental Health, in Norwich, and other parts of the country. Very, very big campaigns. And I think that degree, because again, the othering of people with mental health problems is something we have to challenge. It's becoming easier to challenge it because mental distress is now so common. And if you're not experiencing it yourself, you know somebody who is. So I think some of these divisions are breaking down, and I think as socialists we do that. And just the final point I would make, and I would say it very strongly, this is an issue for socialists. Okay? What is going on? This epidemic of mental distress is something that we have something to say about, right? It is rooted, and it's rooted in our understanding of a neoliberal capitalism whose only concern is accumulation, accumulate, which cares not a fig for our health or our well-being or whatever. And that is really what whether that's through competition, whether it's through also, and I'll just mention the other current feature within mental health services again is the notion of recovery. And it's another nice example of how neoliberalism incorporates progressive sounding terms, right, and really frankly pollutes them, because actually recovery, which essentially there's a progressive core to it, but people find their own solutions, becomes you can do it by yourself. Who needs services? So we also need to challenge that. But just as I say, finally, that I think this is a central issue for socialists, and that means that on the one hand, wherever there are local groups or activists, whatever, fighting to defend mental health, or fighting for better mental health services, socialists have to be part of that. But I think more generally, and I think absolutely final point is that it doesn't have to be like this. And I think the argument that in a different kind of society, a socialist society, frankly, we would have better mental health services, but the reality is we would have much less need for them, because so much of the current distress flows from the shitty society we live in. Thank you.